Hi there, everyone. It's 1 o'clock. We welcome you to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break on a Wednesday, along with Edgar Zazweta. I'm Naj Alakan. Remember, this is our live and interactive show, so go ahead and say hello to us from where you're coming in from. Of course, we welcome your questions and comments. Edgar, how are you today?
Good, Naj. Good to see you. Good to see everybody online, and a lot going on, but always happy to spend some time here on Wednesdays.
Yeah, we've got a packed show for everybody today. We've got information for you on small groups, on attendance, on legal liability. We are going to go wall to wall here on governmental relations information, but it's rare that we get to start with some breaking news, but we do have breaking news today that's come out of the state capitol. Some information that's come in from the Associated Press that's been updating over the last couple of hours. A couple of confirmed cases of COVID-19 has shut down the Senate floor session today. There hasn't been confirmation, at least within the last few minutes, as to who exactly were the two people, whether it was two lawmakers or two staff members, or if it's one of each. This is the second time that the legislature has been delayed. And these meetings, the in-person meetings, and Edgar, you can talk a little bit about this. The requirement has been there about wearing masks and physical distancing, but it is our understanding right now that the Senate session is closed for the rest of the day. So then, Edgar, I would ask you, this is the final week of floor session, so that means the Senate will not meet today. What does that mean for the floor sessions moving forward and just in general this legislative session?
Yeah, I think it's another example of life in the age of COVID, right? And I think just like all of our members have to be thinking about contingency plans when they're in-person instruction about what happens when we have infections. That's obviously something that the state legislature and just policymakers in general have been having to grapple with. And it's been a struggle. I mean, this year, they've now changed their schedule a number of times, shut down, went on recess, adjusted for these cases, limited the amount of staff that was coming into the Capitol. But this is always a real dilemma for the policymakers in Sacramento, because on one hand, the Capitol is the people's house. It's supposed to be this open access where policy gets made. But just given what we're facing from a health situation makes it real difficult. So yeah, as you said, Naj, it looks like they're still trying to figure out to what extent is this isolated? Does this impact numerous individuals? It's serious enough where they're shutting things down, at least for today. There's going to be some serious questions about, one, what do you do for the rest of the week? As you said, the legislative deadline was next Monday. It was going to be the last time that they were going to meet. How it works, every 2 years, our deadline is August 31st. The legislature has, per the Constitution, till August 31st to take action on any bills. So that can't just be changed. That's state constitution. So that's one dilemma that they're having. The other is that we're talking about the Senate. But the Senate and the Assembly reside in the same building, right? It's not like there's any magic plexiglass, as some others were talking about on Twitter, that there's no magic that's going to separate that from the other house. So now the question is, what does the Assembly do? So in terms of implications here for us that are watching state policy here for the next couple of days and weeks, is that there's still a lot of business that they had to finish on. There was trailer bills relating to education, some issues, some cleanup from what was done earlier this summer. There's a number of bills that we were still trying to push. Frankly, and I have to say, some of the things that maybe we didn't want, so maybe that's not the worst thing in the world if those get dealt with. But it's not clear how they're going to deal with this, if they're going to be able to still finish their session. They'll have a few options. I mean, they have some options of they could just decide, okay, we're done, and whatever is done is done. I have to imagine that's not where they're going to want to go, given some of these important pieces. If they meet that deadline, there is still this possibility. I think we were talking about this last week, that the governor could call a special session.
Right.
So you could take some action there. But again, just it's another example of how COVID just puts everything in this tentative state, right? As much as we may try to plan, whether it be schools or workplace, in this case, just what's happening in terms on the policy front, it's impacting every aspect of our life.
Yeah, and you know what, Edgar, I'm glad that you brought this up. And folks, for those of you who are watching, please send in your questions and your comments. We're happy to have all of you. Edgar, you brought up special session because we talked about special session last week. If we're not able to get back into floor sessions this week, is that the impetus then that maybe we need to have a special session? Because we've heard stakeholders, whether they're in education or something else, have talked about, hey, we need another special session to be able to move some of this legislation forward. Just through your lens, is that the impetus maybe for there to be some additional advocacy on that?
I think it's clear there's going to be some unresolved issues that aren't just going to get dealt with in the next few days, whether because of this current health situation that just popped up in the last day, or I think from our end, and we'll hear from our guest here in a few minutes about there's some issues that we've been pushing that frankly we're not sure that we're going to be able to get to the finish line. So there's going to be some additional advocacy that's going to be necessary. And I think on the issues that we were talking about last week, there's a number of groups like our partners in labor and CTA and others, SEIU, are talking about revenue initiatives, really having the legislature think about something that's going to target additional dollars specifically to schools, because if we don't get some of this federal support, or if the economy continues to struggle, what are we going to do? Are we going to face a big financial cliff in terms of funding specifically to schools?
We want to say hello to our viewers out there, Glenda and Rebecca and Amy and Antoinette, and make sure if you're out there today watching, you say hello to us. So Edgar, we've got 3 issues to talk about today. Small groups, attendance, legal liability. Let's hit small groups first, because I think you and I and many others have been waiting day after day for this information to come down. We were talking about it as early as the beginning of last week, and now it's finally come here. Some details on it. This small group guidance applies to schools that can't reopen for in-person instruction pursuant to the July 17th framework. The cohorting guidance that comes from this, I think this is really important. These cohorts cannot be any larger than 14 students, and there are 2 supervising adults. The number of cohorts depends on school enrollment and building capacity. And then the cohorts, they can't be mixed, and the supervising adults are assigned to only 1 cohort. So let's unpack this, Edgar, as far as the small groups, your analysis, and maybe how that's going to impact some of these school districts moving forward.
Yeah, like you said, we've been waiting for this for a while, and I know more importantly, our members have been waiting, and in many of our districts, school's already started. And so the intent here, I think you covered it well, Naj, in terms of just how we got here. So essentially, in July, governor puts forth this new guidance on which schools are eligible for in-person instruction. There was a waiver process, which we've also talked about on this show. They made it clear that waiver was supposed to be differentiated from this. These cases, the waiver was for elementary schools in counties that are on the monitoring list that are not eligible for in-person instruction. So we got asked the question, we were asking the question since day one, what about situations for students? And some examples of this would be students with disabilities, English learners, other targeted groups that may require specific support, either because distance learning may not be conducive to some of their own individual learning needs, or in cases where as a mode of intervention, where we're seeing that kids, we start in distance learning for one reason or another, that is not going well. Is there other strategies that we could take into account and actually try to get small groups in there? And so as we had been initially told, is that yes, that's going to be permissible, but we're going to put more information out on this. I think what we saw here is that information and those guidelines in terms of how to make that workable. I think the key, you hit on it, small groups, less than 14 students. Some of it, frankly, I think the bigger challenge will probably from a staffing standpoint, because there's not supposed to be any intermingling of the staff as well, in terms of if you're assigned to a specific cohort, then you have to be with that cohort. and they leave a lot of discretion. Like the one theme through everything in the COVID pandemic is they don't answer every question. They leave it up to the LEA, to our schools, to determine who should be eligible for these, quote, specialized targeted services. They give us examples like the students with disabilities, English learners, but it's not necessarily limited to that. There is some limitations, though. They don't want this to be essentially a back channel to open up schools in counties that are on the monitoring list. So there's some prescription there about that it can't be more than 25% of your population that is actually eligible for these services.
Hey, Edgar, let me ask you, because Don Austin, who's the great superintendent over at Palo Alto Unified, asks a question about the 14-2 ratio, the 7-1 ratios. Any thoughts about how this can work? Let me go specifically to read his entire question. Modified, I believe modified. Severe kids have 1-to-1 assistance. It seems like 14-2 or 7-to-1 ratios don't work. Any thoughts or analysis? Because you talked about there is some ambiguity, and I think that the governor wants to have some of these be local decisions, or have all of them be local decisions. But any thoughts on how that can work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think right away, this is an example of how sometimes the administration and the California Department of Public Health, they put a lot of time into this, and they're trying to think about it. They asked for input, and they took their time to put this out. But the one challenge, and I think we've seen this in numerous examples, is that some of the guidance, sometimes it's the public, they're looking at it from a public health standpoint, right? They're looking at it in terms of cohorts, how to minimize the spread of COVID. Now, the one thing that has continued to be a challenge is how much are those guidelines grounded in the practicalities of our schools. And I think Don brings up a good example, especially as it relates with students with disabilities. We've actually posed this question, and I think they may need to clarify a little bit. My guess is going to be, like so many other aspects of this, is that they're going to lean on local county health. While they say these are state guidelines and we want you to generally abide by these, at the end of the day, work in consultation with local county public health if you need to deviate. They do go as far as saying that you don't need local county public health to sign off on this, that this should be in consultation with them, but you don't necessarily need approval, as if unlike what we had with the waivers, where your public county health officer has to specifically approve your plan.
You know what, Edgar, it's a good thing that you're highly knowledgeable on this subject, because we are getting a lot of questions coming in, so we'll just hit them. Angela Shull asks, is a cohort of students defined on a daily basis, or can the groups change daily and weekly? That is a good question, because I know you and I are soccer coaches outside in our other capacity, and I think that there are some leagues that have structured it on a cohort basis. And maintain that coach has to be with that cohort. How are these groups defined? Is it's solid, this is how it is, or it's going to be able to change?
Yeah, great question. The intent again is that they're stable groups, that they're not groups that change on a regular basis. So essentially you have this learning pod, this cohort that is specific to the instructor, the two staff, and the group of students. There is provisions, and they state they want to minimize the amount that we change those groups as much as possible. But they do give some leeway there in terms of as needed. But undoubtedly, the intent from the public health standpoint is that these are consistent groups. And the reason for all of this, again, is in the event that there is an infection, this all comes down to contact tracing, that they want to be able to isolate that group. And as opposed to having to shut down all of the cohorts, or even when we get back into full in-person instruction, I know some of our schools are, it's about shutting down cohorts as opposed to the whole entire group or the entire school. So the intent is that these are stable and consistent groups.
Got two questions, and then unless we have more come in, let me hit you with two questions. One comes from our former president, Holly Eads. Is there any indication that the cohort size would carry forward to future in-person instruction? And then Socorro Shields asks, how does this interact with insurance and liability? The liability part might be something that we work with our guests a little bit later on in the show. But she also asked, does insurance become a deciding factor? And right now, that's not necessarily being discussed. So I gave you two. Where do we go on this?
Yeah, let me hit on Holly's first in terms of whether these numbers should be expected when we get to in-person instruction. The one thing that this guidance says is they've already set out the rules for in-person instruction and under what guidelines. And I think they spell out, try to keep them cohorts, but they do not spell out a number. So absent any changes, there would be some more flexibility there in terms of what cohorts look like, especially in middle school or in high school. So the old rules that we came out in July 17th still apply. One big plug, I should have said this right off the bat. I know there's a ton of information here. ACSA's done write-ups. We've attached FAQs, put out everything that the state has. I would encourage everybody to go to our resource hub, and I'm sure somebody on our team here will link it to that, where you could see the actual documents and read through the FAQs. So it's a great question. I think the intent is that they would love, in an ideal world, to have this kind of cohort system apply even in in-person instruction on the natural. This is where we face in some of the logistical and operational realities in terms of, do we even have enough staff to do that in terms of 14 students per cohort? The insurance and liability, I'm gonna punt there since we're an expert to talk about that. So I'll wait for Derrick, and
we'll get to him in a moment. Hey, I do want to ask a question because Christina Corey asked an important question, and this probably relies on a little bit of clarification, because I know when I've talked with educators about small groups, sometimes there isn't necessarily the clarity of what it is. But Christina asks, what happens with our SPED populations who have sensory deficits and can't abide by the PPEs or the safety guidelines? And I think that's a really important question because there is some ambiguity to this, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I think in terms of there is some specifics there, exemptions for students with disabilities or other students that wearing a face covering may not be applicable. And again, the rules that they initially put forth for schools still apply. What we've seen here in the last couple of days specific to small groups, it's supposed to be this exemption for them. But I think the best place there is to refer back to what the guidelines were initially in terms of going this far to face coverings. And hopefully I don't get this information wrong, because it's been a while since we talked about it, but it's K through 1 students are not, there's no mandate for face coverings. Second grade or on, there is, but again, there is language about calling out exemptions for populations like students with disabilities.
All right, folks, keep those questions coming in, the comments coming in as well. We're going to try, we've got two more topics to cover here.
I will, because in the corner of my eye, and this is an important one that I meant to, I see that Robin is asking about bargaining units and our employees. And yes, this is a really important piece. The big question, and I think that our members are facing, is despite the guidelines, what is the reality from a bargaining standpoint or from a labor standpoint in terms of working with our employee groups to actually be able to put forth these programs? And we acknowledge that this has been a challenge in some of our communities where, frankly, there hasn't been agreement in terms of to what extent are we going to get our employees to sign off on some of these initiatives to bring in some of these small cohorts. So I think the labor piece, the labor consideration is an important one to reference, because yes, you could have state guidelines, but ultimately the hard work still resides, unfortunately, in our members and in working through some of these tough conversations with our labor partners.
All right, well, folks, keep those questions coming in. Let's move over to another topic, and this is on the attendance issue. This guidance also comes out. Districts, LEAs won't need to collect and report ADA, obviously, for this year, because there is, the hold harmless, but there is going to be the need to track attendance for CalPADs and annual audits. LEAs must maintain daily participation and weekly engagement records during distance learning. CDE has created a template that's designed to apply to the entire class. I do want to say, and Edgar mentioned it, a lot of this content available on the ACSA Resource Hub. with a lot of information, content.acsa.org. But Edgar, if you want to just give about a minute analysis on the attendance issue.
Yeah, this has been a persistent question from our members in terms of trying to deal with what are the guidelines in terms of attendance accounting. I know sometimes this is not the sexiest issue, but again, it's the nuts and bolts about like how schools work and how we're going to be accountable, how we're going to access our funding. So we've been pushing a lot for this about what are the guidelines in terms of this attendance accounting? What are going to be, is there going to be some template in terms of these weekly engagement activities? So the CDE, for the spirit of brevity, they put out a number of FAQs, some model templates as well. So we're going to be working through that. I understand they had a webinar earlier this week, the California Department of Ed. They had more than 3,000 people. I believe they were going to do another one today. So a lot of interest in this area. So I would refer folks to the hub where they can see what CDE put out there.
That's right, and that's content.acsa.org, or you can access that from the start of our website, from the homepage, ACSA.org. We want to bring in Derick Lennox, who's the ACSA Legislative Advocate, one of the ACSA Legislative Advocates. Derrick has been monitoring what happens over at the Capitol as far as the sessions are concerned. We're going to tackle that and the legal liability issue. Derrick, thanks so much for being with us today. I want to start off. We know that the Senate had to suspend floor sessions today because of the positive COVID test. We're still gathering information as that comes in. But as it stands right now, with just a couple of days left before floor sessions officially end, before the session ends, what K-12 issues are right now still being debated?
Hey guys, thanks for having me. We've got a couple of outstanding issues that are still being debated on the Assembly and Senate floor. But for the most part, as you all know in the audience at this point, most of what's going on with school reopening is being driven by the governor and the administration due to his authority in that respect. So we've only got a couple of outstanding issues. One is a pretty technical bill, but it's an important one because it relates to ADA, and that's SB 820. This is actually what they consider to be a cleanup bill from the overall state budget. It's got, excuse me, some provisions around ADA increases and what happens if you see that, because you'll recall that our guarantee for funding in this current school year is based on last year's numbers. But what happens if you have substantial growth? Who gets to benefit from that? Who doesn't? That's all in there. So we're keeping a close eye on that. And then AB 1835 by Dr. Shirley Weber is a bill that is strictly school finance, but it's really got an equity lens because it's about carrying over those unspent supplemental and concentration grant dollars from year to year to make sure that they continue to benefit those kids if they do get transferred from one year to the next. So two big issues, but for the most part, this has been a memorable end of session as these things go, for the reason that there's just not a lot of legislation left.
Derrick, so one of the things that I know we've been talking about, and you mentioned liability, we've been talking a lot about in-person instruction. We've been talking to a lot of our members in terms of this issue of the lack of protection, and is this going to be a hurdle to some folks actually opening up? So kind of what's the latest on that front? What have we heard from I know you spent a lot of time this week, not only working with the broader coalition, but working with our members. Kind of what are you hearing? What have we learned on this issue?
And being a relatively new ACSA advocate, even though I've worked in education for quite some time, is how great our members are. And when we have done calls to action on issues like this, they stepped up. And what I'm about to say next has only occurred because ACSA members have been so active in responding to our calls. So we appreciate that. So we know that when it comes to school reopening and distance learning and everything you're going through right now, it's all about health and safety and educational services and how do we balance those two things. But I say this, and I say this as a lawyer, unfortunately, litigation has a big role in our society, and it's something that we have to be conscious of. Oftentimes, it's a good thing. It holds our feet to the fire in many respects so that we don't do negligent things. Other times, you have cases like COVID-19. And with COVID-19, no matter how perfect you are in terms of your health and safety protocols, this is a highly transmissible disease that we're still learning a lot about. It could still spread. And so that's given rise to a lot of reluctance among educators and school administrators about, do we want to open at all? And in the last couple of weeks, especially, we've heard a flood of information from the field saying, but for this issue, we would be pretty dang close to reopening our schools. So that's what we've taken to the legislature, to the governor's office. Typically, your insurance would cover things like this, but I can't see the chat box right at this moment, but I'm sure that there are comments that are going to be there or have been there about our insurance is not covering it. They've told us they're not covering it. So how do we eat all of this in our general fund during a recession and still do health, safety, and education for our kids? So that's been the big impetus to work on the bill AB 1384 this year by Assemblymember O'Donnell, principal co-authored by Susan Rubio, a senator from Southern California. We've made a lot of headway on that one, but it's hit some roadblocks because it's a really tricky issue to work on for legislators. So I'll pause there and see where you're going with the next question.
Yeah, and folks, we want to encourage you to keep your questions coming in. Of course, we talked about small groups and attendance before coming to Derrick, and we're going to try and tackle as many of your questions because they are flooding in on all three of these topics. Derrick, what has ACSA been doing to fix the issue of COVID liability of the K-12 schools up to this point?
Right, and so I referenced AB 1384, the bill by Assemblymember O'Donnell. That's been one of the number of ways that we've been trying to tackle this. In Sacramento, there's more than one way to get to where you want to go. So a bill is the most prominent, the most publicly transparent. It's probably the best way in most cases, but it hasn't stopped us from looking down every other street and alleyway that we can to work on this. Part of what ACSA has been really instrumental in doing is not only raising the consciousness of this issue for lawmakers and policymakers, but also rallying school districts and school leaders to be a part of that conversation as well. So when we helped put together a coalition letter, which is a really important symbol for lawmakers about, is this a real deal issue that I have to pay attention to? We helped, ACSA alone got 165 different LEAs to sign on to this letter and say to their own lawmakers, this is important. And that gives us a ton of leverage when we go and talk about it up here in Sacramento. All told, I think that letter had over 230 organizations, of which ACSA contributed some 160. So what has happened with the bill now is it has been held in committee. The response from the committee chair was, look, in the time of COVID, we just don't have time to tackle every single issue. You know what we said, obviously, which is how could there be a more fundamental issue than COVID for our schools and the reopening of the economy and getting kids back in the classroom. But nevertheless, they said we'll have to defer on this issue. One of the things that I can update this group on, and it's lucky that we met today, not yesterday, is just yesterday, Wes Smith and the other executive directors of several associations, CSBA, CASBO, ACSA, and a representative from LA Unified, all met with the governor's chief deputies, not only on education, but for their global policy. And they had a really good conversation about this issue, even though there's a lot going on. And I think that what you mentioned about very limited time at the end of session here to get something done is contributing to this. There was a very clear understanding of what the problem was and an agreement that it was a problem. And this is a legitimate issue that schools are going to have to grapple with. But at the end of the day, I don't want to get folks' hopes up. You all are doing the good work for the kids in the field. It may not come to fruition in these final days of session, especially if they're going to have to shut down here. So I think it's just really important to have clear eyes about the likelihood of getting something done in these last couple of days of session.
I see we have a really engaged group today, and they're firing questions on it. So we're going to try to do a lightning round after this.
Go for it.
To sum up on this issue, Derrick. So obviously we were talking about the timeline. Things there's still some hurdles. To what extent? I mean, just what is our long-term prospects of this? Not only this next week, but kind of where does this fight continue on this issue as we move forward?
The fight has to continue, and there's a recognition by Wes, our executive director, and others that we have to continue the fight. Very likely, if we can't get it done in the next couple of days, and we're not stopping here, we're going to either look to a special session. We're going to look to January when the legislature restarts. We know that's after the school year started, but it's just the constraints that we're working within this time. In the meantime, work really closely with your public health directors, follow the CDPH guidance and the local guidance to the extent that you can and are required to, because that, and I'm putting on my attorney hat here, is what attorneys are going to look at in terms of, did you provide due care for your kids? Let's see what you're required to do, and did you do those things? I'm not even going to comment on whether you can do all of those things and whether they conflict or anything like that. But that's my 2 cents on that.
A lawyer, Derrick, you'll appreciate our broadcast standards are a little bit unique, and we're just going to blow past this 1:30 bottom of the hour time slot that we normally take because we've got so many questions that have come in. This is from Brad. Brad, I'm not going to mispronounce your last name because that would be wrong, especially for somebody named Naj. But he asks, any conversations about reviewing the CDE attendance engagement accounting expectations? The forms require considerable teacher work, both for daily and weekly. The system is overloaded. Derrick, Edgar, go ahead and chime in on that one.
Yeah, this is a piece of feedback that we've been hearing in terms of just, some of the guidelines that are actually coming out in practice. And what, this theme of state guidelines, but what does that actually mean for the folks that have to operationalize this? What does it actually mean for the educator? What does it mean for the administrator who has to keep this accountable? So that is definitely something that we have been pushing back and providing some feedback to CDE and others who did this. I think there was another question related to this on how does this impact the accountability and how are we going to be kept accountable? So maybe Derrick can talk about a little bit of our efforts on the audit and kind of what we're trying to do to protect our folks on that front of it.
Yeah, there's a big recognition, definitely at ACSA, but I think among policymakers and now the controller's office and CDE and the Department of Finance that you all are building programs to operationalize what was in this year's state budget, SB 98. But at the same time, you don't know what's in the audit guide to be able to say, this counts, this doesn't, you tracked this right, you should have done this instead. And that's what we're spending a lot of time advocating on right now. So keep in touch with us on these issues. We're talking a lot with the membership about what are you doing, what's working for you. We want to maximize your flexibility to appropriately implement the law. But at the same time, we don't want every school district to have to reinvent the wheel. So the more that we can do to help provide templates and that sort of thing, that's what we're working on right now.
Let's bring in a question from the Calaveras COE. And if that's the great county superintendent, Scott Nanick over in Calaveras, you should let us know. If not, and you're just one of the county office employees, we won't tell Scott that you're watching the show right now. The question is, if the student doesn't attend the synchronous part of the day, are they absent? And the synchronous and asynchronous instruction has been such a big topic here. So how do we answer the Calaveras question?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is where it's helpful to have an attorney on staff like Derrick, because I know this was a persistent question we were getting early on when the statute was written about the differentiation about daily interaction. And I'll let Derrick speak on that, as he could probably cite the actual statute, but that's the requirement in terms of having daily interaction. And there's some mechanisms how to meet that. And if I'm not mistaken, there's even some mechanisms for when daily instruction or through synchronous methodology is not available, that this district, and I think Mohammed and others pointed this out, that a district can develop their own alternative plan, but the board has to actually do that. Derrick, what would you add to that? And you could correct me if I got anything wrong.
I would add that at tomorrow's superintendent's council meeting, and I think most folks here would be able to find a link if they'd want to, and maybe we can help publicize that here. We are going to have attendance accounting experts from CDE attend, and this would be exactly the appropriate type of question to ask them.
We've got.
I love that. You heard the lawyerly answer there. I love it.
We like a punt. And see, I was correct. I just saw it pop up. That is Scott over in Calaveras from the County Office of Education, the county soup there. I knew he was watching. He wouldn't miss this show. Roxanne Fuentes asked, any possibility of extending the September 1 in compliance date, especially since the template and guidance is just being received? Is it fluid? That would be a question.
Yeah. Well, and I think this probably I'll try to use Derrick's methodology here and punt to this is going to come down to the accounting piece of it, right? The statute, in terms of what it's looking like, I think that's may be a tough sell because that was spelled in as part of the law. And as we've told, we're not even sure if they're going to change or pass any more laws here in the next couple of days. So I think that's going to be difficult. Now, to what extent they're going to utilize these deadlines and be punitive if somebody is not, following the exact letter of the law, how are they going to audit us? How they're going to keep us accountable for this? I think that goes to some of the work that Derrick was talking about.
Yes, I would not count on them changing that 9/1 date. I'm sorry, that's not a helpful answer, but I just wouldn't count on it.
Is that what goes into? I'll ask you guys this because we just talked about it in some cases being fluid, but a lack of ambiguity at times. What would go into if this date was changed or if it was manipulated in some way? Is there some type of process, procedures that would be needing to get through different types of measurables or achievables before something like this was manipulated?
Yeah, and this one again, because this was part of the original budget bill that was they actually passed statute, they created a law, the governor signed it, so it essentially would have to go right back through that effort to get that modified, because that's been spelled out now in the ed code, as opposed to some of the things when we've talked about some of the things that are more at the discretion at a regulatory level, whether it be CDE or the controller's office in terms of how they're going to keep us accountable. I think that's where we make the differentiation of how much are we going to be able to shift things here in the short term. Now, with that said, regardless of the feasibility of this, I think this is where this feedback and these conversations we have virtually with our members, whether it be on this show or some of the other outlets, are really great for us because it informs our practice and it informs our advocacy in terms of being able to go and relay to the policymakers, like, here's the real impact of this, and this is how it's looking in the field.
Let me just encourage everybody. We've got a couple of minutes left, so definitely get in your questions now. We're hearing from so many members today. We're past the bottom of the hour, so we appreciate you staying with us. We do have another question that's coming from Socorro. The weekly log revealed this week appears to be very time intensive. What is the penalty if this isn't followed? It's a great question because there is so much accountability to this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'll lean on Derrick to on the if he remembers that the part in terms of what the repercussions are. I think this is the same issue that others have noted, where CD does this webinar, they give us the answers. I think this has been a pretty consistent reaction, not only for administrators, but I understand that even some of our partners in labor and the teacher ranks are having that same reaction in terms of what this is actually going to entail to meet all these requirements as being spelled out by CDE and this template that they asked us to use. And my understanding, somebody earlier asked about the template, that was intended to be a model in terms of how you can utilize this. I think there is some discretion there to use it in a different way. Derrick, would you add anything to that?
I agree with everything you said. The only thing I would add is that the penalty for non-compliance with those requirements for distance learning that we saw in SB 98 is your ADA. So for them, it's all or nothing, and you've got to hit those markers. And all I can say right now is that we can validate back to you and the field that we're hearing it from all of you, and the time-intensive nature, both for your certificated staff and non-certificated staff, but also administrative staff to help oversee that, is incredibly time-consuming. I asked a county office just yesterday, how the heck are you doing it? They said we had to build our own Excel model with the formulas and all of that. And I said, and then what, you go through and check that each of the kids is there? They said, oh, that's not it, because we have to make sure there's peer-to-peer interaction. I said, is there another checkbox for that? He goes, that's not the only checkbox there is. It goes on and on. So they're sort of building the plane as they're flying it. We recognize that, and I just wanted you to hear that we're hearing the same problems too, and that's what we're trying to work on right now. But just remember, the condition, it is a condition for your ADA funding.
Well, and I Derrick, your quote there, we're building the plane as we fly it. I mean, it is that has been life in this COVID-19 realm. I do want to ask you, as we get ready to close out this show, and since your boss is my co-host, I figured this would be a great opportunity to ask this with as much clarity as we can have. I know you're a big NBA basketball fan. So the question I have for you, since you've been working from home and you have a new child at the house, how many games have you watched while the teams are in the bubble throughout this whole process?
Knowing that my boss, Edgar, is sitting right there, I really have to think hard about my answer. I really try to limit my watching to the evening games. And sometimes the work does spill into the evening, but when the kids are asleep, it's tube time, and we catch what's going on in the bubble. So it's been a very important part of my mental health recovery during this pandemic to see basketball return and have that be a part of my wife and I our nightly tradition. So thanks for the good question.
Derrick,
Edgar.
He's solid in terms of it being a lawyer, right? He takes that right into the very end. I was gonna give him a hard time. I said the reason he's not maybe watching so many of them, and this goes to you, Naj, is because you guys are Kings fans.
Right. Yeah. So. Yeah. Hey, you know what? Let me ask Derrick this. And by the way, Edgar, it was my San Francisco Giants that won last night on a walk-off 2-run over. But we won't dig too deep into that. Edgar, our member, Muhammad Warad, he's a loyal viewer over in Elk Grove Unified. He asked, can the Blazers make a comeback? I will tell you, Edgar is correct. I'm a Kings fan. I stopped watching when the Kings were eliminated out of the bubble. What about the Blazers in the bubble right now?
I think Lillard. I'm a Laker fan, so I'm biased here. I think Lillard is going to be out here, so no more game time. So I don't know. I think it would be a tough going for them to get over the 3-1 deficit. But I am biased. I will admit.
Derrick, you got a response on that?
I agree with everything my boss said.
All right, Derrick Lennox, ACSA Legislative Advocate. Edgar's his boss. We told him he had to be here today. Derrick, thanks so much for being with us today, past 1:30. We appreciate it. All right, Edgar, boy, we had a good show today. A lot of good interaction. A lot of our new viewers in today. That sets us up for a very interesting last couple of days here for this legislative session. I have not gotten any updated information on who may have been diagnosed with COVID, but I'm assuming that this is going to remain a story for the next couple of days because we have such a truncated timeline as far as the legislative session is concerned.
Yeah, the situation is fluid, and I think our folks can relate to this, just given what they're doing in dealing with distance learning, thinking about in-person instruction. So it's just another aspect of that. I mean, I think it goes without saying. We say it every week, but it's just everything that we're trying to do here in terms of putting information out, and we appreciate people, their gratitude. But we recognize it's you folks that are doing the hard work down in our schools. And as a parent, as somebody who gets to represent our administrators, we're just utterly thankful for the hard work you're all doing. So we'll keep trying to grind away and get you answers and change the answers when need be. But there'll definitely be a lot more to come in the weeks to come.
Yeah, certainly correct. And folks, for those of you who want to dig a little bit deeper and get more of those talking points and those bullet points on the small groups, on the attendance, on legal liability, it's all available on the ACSA Resource Hub, content.acsa.org, or you can access the hub from the homepage of our website at acsa.org. Edgar, good seeing you, man. Good show today.
Yeah, it's always fun, Naj. We'll see you next week.
Yep. All right, folks. Thanks so much for joining us today. Remember, we are back next week with the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break that comes your way 1 p.m. next Wednesday here on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Have a great day.